In his memoir, Never a Slow Day, this newspaper veteran shares some adventures from a career that spanned 4 decades. Frank Aukofer returns as my special guest next on I Remember. Hi, I'm Jim Peck. Welcome to I Remember. Joining me again tonight is Frank Aukofer. In 1960, he started as a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal, later became chief of that newspaper's Washington, D.C. bureau. Now he's put together a book reflecting on some 40 years in the business, covering a variety of people.
As a college student, Frank Aukofer received the first scholarship awarded by the Milwaukee chapter of Sigma Delta Chi, later known as the Society of Professional Journalists. He graduated from Marquette University in 1960, and the next day he started as a rookie reporter at the Milwaukee Journal. Frank was there in 1964 when Alabama Governor George Wallace ran the first of his 4 presidential campaigns. Wallace was against school integration. Aukofer covered civil rights stories during the 1960s, from voting rights in Selma to local protests against school segregation and the fight for open housing. In June 1968, Frank was at the Lincoln Memorial when Coretta Scott King spoke at the Poor People's Campaign. After a decade in the Milwaukee Journal's newsroom, Frank was assigned to the newspaper's Washington bureau. Before Richard Nixon resigned the presidency in 19 hearings. While covering a congressional delegation, he attended a reception in Havana. It gave him a chance to speak with Cuban President Fidel Castro. In 1978, during Jimmy Carter's administration, Frank became president of the National Press Club. Anwar Sadat of Egypt spoke at a newsmakers' lunch. When Patrick Lucey left the Wisconsin governor's mansion to become John Anderson's vice presidential running mate, Aukofer covered the local angle. He had the opportunity to interview President Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office. He was part of the first group of reporters to go to Saudi Arabia in 1990 during Desert Shield. When Frank Aukofer retired from the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, President Clinton was wrapping up his term in office. Some highlights of his career are in his book, Never a Slow Day, Adventures of a 20th Century Newspaper Reporter.
In all your years as a reporter, the President of the United States resign?
Well, he actually resigned shortly after I came to Washington, so I really
You saw it happen.
Oh yeah, well, I never. Yeah, in fact, I was in the East Room when he announced it, but I didn't really think much about it. But who would have thought a president would resign? I mean, it was. I came to Washington in 1970. He resigned in '74 after all the Watergate commotion and all that stuff. So,
should Nixon have been impeached? Or
yeah,
I should say, would he have been if he hadn't?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And should he have been? Yeah, probably. I think so. But he did. You know, he got the word from prominent Republicans in the Senate that his position was untenable. The House Judiciary Committee had voted 4 articles of impeachment, I think, and they were on the way to a House vote, but they were in a recess. And in fact, I had come and I got the word from Jack Cole, who was then the bureau chief, and I was the Indian, that Nixon was going to resign. So I jumped in our '70 Chevy wagon and drove helter-skelter all the way back to Washington. And I was standing in the East Room when he announced his resignation.
In your book, you say that the people on television actually had a better view than the reporters.
Yeah. Well, we were stuck in the East Room, and he made the announcement, and then he left, and then all the other stuff was television stuff because he got on the helicopter and did the famous thing with the, pulling the buttons off his coat with his fingers up and so forth. So everybody was watching. I mean, I saw it later, obviously, but I didn't see any of that live because he had already left.
If he had been impeached, do you think he would have been convicted?
I believe so, yeah. I think because of the charges were so serious and the evidence was so strong with all the tapes and so forth, and we're starting to see more of it. I think that's the word that he got, from senators who were members of his own party and conservatives like he was. They just said, your situation's untenable and you better get out while the getting's good.
You covered the impeachment proceedings for Bill Clinton as well.
Yes.
Which always struck me as being a very different set of circumstances. I don't know whether that was because the press liked Clinton better but it always seemed different to me.
It was different in the sense that most people, I would say most people thought that the Clinton impeachment was more political than the Nixon impeachment had been. An example of the Nixon impeachment was Harold Freilich, who was a Republican congressman from northeastern Wisconsin, who is now a judge up in Appleton, a very respected judge. He was a very conservative guy. He was expected to be totally knee-jerk for Nixon. And in the end, he thought that was the right thing to do. And that's what sort of pervaded the Nixon thing, people trying to find the right thing to do as far as he was concerned. Whereas the Clinton impeachment, because it was, the charges were they weren't quite as serious to a lot of people. A lot of people thought that the conservatives were basically, and the right-wingers were basically out to get Clinton. Now, I'm sure Jim Sensenbrenner would disagree with that because he was on the committee.
Well, but Nixon subverted aspects of the government.
Yes.
He ordered the FBI not to investigate Watergate. He had the IRS running around auditing people who were on the enemies list. Clinton had affairs.
Right. Well, and he tried to cover him up, too, and he lied about him. I mean, that was...
But should he have ever been asked that question? He was in front of a grand jury, and all of a sudden someone came up with the Monica Lewinsky name. And
that aspect of it, I mean, I covered the actual impeachment hearings and so forth. But he was accused of lying, and Kenneth Starr was, relentless in trying to get him. And in the end, the Senate couldn't even muster a majority to convict him. I mean, he did get impeached, where Nixon was never impeached. So Clinton actually was impeached, but not convicted. If he'd been convicted, of course, he'd have been out on his ear.
Yeah. Coming back to Nixon for a minute, we mentioned the Judiciary Committee. You never got to actually sit in those meetings.
No, I always said it was a good thing that I took hallway standing 102 in journalism school, because all of the evidentiary hearings were behind closed doors in the House Judiciary Committee room. So all we could do was to hang out in the hallways, and when the bells would ring for a vote in the House, all of the committee members would come pouring out, trying to get whatever snippets we could. I had two Wisconsin members on the committee, Harold Freilich, who I mentioned, and Bob Kastenmeier, who was the #2 Democrat on the committee behind Peter Rodino. But unfortunately for me as a reporter, I had upstanding type congressmen who didn't leak anything.
That's no fun.
But they would tell me what they could. I mean, that was the stuff that wasn't. So I would have to chase them down the hallways and then spend time on the phone with them after the hearings were over. So it was really a tough story to cover. The Clinton thing, on the other hand, was wide open from the get-go, and after a while, believe it or not, there were empty seats in the Judiciary Committee. I mean, I had a hard time believing that myself.
But how does a reporter go about covering a story if nobody will talk to you?
Well, you just keep asking questions, and you get as much as you can, and and then you have other people who can help fill in. I think I can cover a story myself, but I had a wonderful editor, Carl Schwartz, who is now the national editor of the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. And when we made the decision that even though we only had a two-person bureau, we were going to cover the whole Nixon impeachment for ourselves.
Yeah, I want to talk to you about how you convinced the Journal Sentinel to let you do that.
Well, it was the Milwaukee Journal then.
At that time.
Yes. But I think they just decided that we were a major metropolitan newspaper. We were always listed in the top 10, sometimes in the top 5 in the country. And when I proposed it, and Jack Cole, my partner, said, okay, you can do it. He could have Bigfooted me and taken it over himself. But he said, okay, and I don't think the editors really ever argued it. And then what they did was they designated Carl, who was then a young copy desk editor on the national desk, and he went out and made himself into a total expert on every aspect of Watergate. And so he knew things that I had no clue about. So whenever there were holes in the story, Carl could fill them in. So I had a lot of help.
Could Woodward and Bernstein have done what they did without Deep Throat, their great source?
I don't know. I mean, he was a great source. There's no question about it. And if I think back to those days, they were coming up with a lot of stories that were, as an old friend of mine once said, who went into the newsletter business after newspapering. He wasn't covering stories anymore. He was covering increments. Well, the Watergate stories as they were coming out in the Washington Post at the time, unless you saw the big picture and felt it, you'd look at it and say, well, you know, that doesn't seem very, but they were always doing increments and working on them. So I suppose it's possible that even without Deep Throat, they might have come up with it. But I have no idea, obviously.
They seem to be the ones that kept that whole thing going, particularly at the beginning when really it was the second-rate burglary that people talked about, and it didn't seem to be a story.
Well, there was a reporter for the New York Times who was supposed to be covering that, and he didn't really think much of the story. And so the New York Times got killed on it, and the Washington Post eventually prevailed. But it took a lot of guts for a lot of people, including Katharine Graham, who was the publisher, and was getting a lot of pressure from a lot of people saying, what are you doing, trying to take down the president?
Including the White House.
Yeah, yeah.
When did you get the gut feeling that we're onto something major here?
I don't think I ever thought of it in those terms because I parachuted in, as we call it. I covered the Watergate hearings in the Senate on an occasional basis, but it wasn't my number one focus. So I wasn't in those days totally focused on that particular story until I started covering it in the Judiciary Committee. Then I was focused every day, 14 hours a day for the duration of it, which went from what I think until April or May until June or July, somewhere around there. So it was every day. It was
a heady time to be in Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah. Well, Washington, D.C. is always a heady place.
Yes, but particularly so, especially with White House credentials.
Yeah, it was. But I didn't spend a lot of time at the White House. The White House is, people think it's so glamorous, and it really is, and it makes reputations, especially for TV people like you. But it's really a terrible beat because you sit around, wait for handouts, and if you work for Midwestern newspapers, I did, you're low on the pecking order. So we never really covered the White House as such. We would jump in when there was a particular story if we were interested, for example, in whether the president was going to declare a disaster area for flooding out in western Wisconsin. That was the kind of stuff we looked for, but we didn't try to cover it on a regular basis.
It was nice to be able to mention to the folks back home that, oh yeah, I was over at the White House today.
Yeah. In fact, shortly after I arrived there in 1970, I was talking to my brother John on the phone back in Milwaukee, and I said, guess what I just did? And he said, what? I said, well, I was on my way back from a press conference, and I stopped by the White House to take a pee.
Now, you also covered the Gulf War, 1 and 2.
I covered the Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Desert Shield was the buildup,
okay.
And I was in the first press pool that was allowed into Saudi Arabia to cover Desert Shield. And there was no independent reporting. There were about 17 or 18 of us, a CNN crew and Time Magazine and AP, Reuters, Scripps Howard News Service, LA Times.
And Aukofer.
And me, yeah. And that was great because we had the story all to ourselves. I mean, we had the military minders were laying everything on they could for us. And in fact, we sat one day watching Tom Brokaw standing outside the fence, literally talking about how hot it was. And we'd already been out and seen the F-15 fighters and the bunkers at the Dow Round Air Base and all that sort of stuff. So we had the story exclusively for about 2.5 weeks.
But in reading Never a Slow Day, your book, I get the feeling that you weren't a big fan of pool reporting.
Well, I think in some cases it's necessary, but the problem with it in the Gulf War was that it was used to control access. And if you never have access to a story, you can never report it. Now, in World War II, guys like Walter Cronkite, who just died, was a foreign correspondent. Well, reporters in World War II wore uniforms, they went with the troops, but they were subject to censorship. Now, I think most reporters would be okay with that. I mean, I certainly would be, because you get to go there, and maybe you can't tell the story now, but eventually you can tell the story. But if you're denied access entirely, you can never tell the story. One of the military officers, information officers, who I worked with on Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Larry Eisnagel, said he had this incredible vision. You know, the battleship Wisconsin and the Missouri were firing cruise missiles at Iraq during the war. And he said, I had this great thing. I saw a split screen. On one side, the Japanese surrender on the deck of the Missouri after World War II.
Yeah.
And on the other side, the Missouri firing cruise missiles. There was only one problem. The skipper of the Missouri said he didn't want any reporters. And Eisnagel said, I know how to salute. So he never got any reporters, and stuff like that never happened.
Why would you do that? It's such a great, I mean, there's nothing, you're not giving away anything.
Well, but, and the Army people, you know, started to realize that. There was a famous story about Walt Boomer had been a PR man, and he was the commander of the Marines in Desert Storm. And he was inviting all the reporters in that he could grab, and he said, especially the former Marines, you know. So he'd get all these reporters in. Molly Moore, the Washington Post, wrote all these glowing stories. So a lot of people thought the Marines had won the war, when it was really the Army who doing the big left hook. And guess what? Most of those Army commanders didn't want reporters, and they didn't get them. And after the thing was over, it was like, duh, you know. So they learned a valuable lesson.
You were embedded.
No, I was never embedded. In fact, I was in the sense of I was in the pool when I went back to cover the war. I was not in the pool, and it was a very tough time because you really couldn't go anywhere or do anything unless you violated the rules. And some people who did got captured and things like that. Or you were subject to having your credentials revoked and things like that. So, but I did a book in '94 and '95 on the military-media relationship called America's Team, The Odd Couple. I was teamed up with a genuine American hero, Bill Lawrence, who was he was a POW at the same time as John McCain and James Stockdale. He was the senior officer, so he made all the decisions. He was a POW for 6 years, later was superintendent of the Naval Academy and commander of the 3rd Fleet. His daughter Wendy was an astronaut, went up to in the space shuttle and so forth. Well, we had a fellowship with the Freedom Forum in Nashville at the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center, and we did this book, and we made a whole bunch of recommendations for improving the relationship, and one of them was embedding reporters with the troops, which happened in the second Gulf, in the latest Iraq War, and they're still doing it.
What happens, and I'm sure it must happen at times, particularly if you are embedded and you see things, and you see things you're not supposed to report. You see maybe a security leak. You had a security leak that you had to deal with in one story where you got a hold of a piece of paper that you shouldn't have.
I think for the most part, you know, when Admiral Lawrence and I did the research on it, we couldn't really find any evidence, almost throughout the history of the military and the media relationship, where a reporter or a newspaper had compromised security to the point where American soldiers were killed. For the most part, you know, the reporters are they're Americans like everybody else. They're patriotic and so forth. And in fact, one great incident happened when I was with right after they opened up coverage in Desert Shield. A bunch of us flew over from Dhahran to Riyadh to go to a wedding palace for a big party the Saudis businessmen were throwing for us. And Sam Donaldson was on, no, I'm sorry, it's different incident. Sam Donaldson was on another flight. But on the way back, our plane was parked near the AWACS unit at the Riyadh Air Base. And as we were getting back on the plane, we took a tour of that facility and we did a bunch of interviews and so forth. And as we were getting back on the plane to take us back to Dhahran, the public affairs officer for the AWACS wing was passing out press kits for everybody. And we got back on the plane, and the LA Times reporter was flipping through it, and he said not holy cow, he said something else, which I wouldn't say until it was something stronger. Inside the press kit was a list of all the members of the unit, the AWACS unit, a locator thing showing where they were staying, what motels they were in, the bus routes they could take, the taxi cabs, everything. It was a locator list in the press kit.
Oh, my Lord.
And so we all recognized what it was, so we went around, collected them all, and we gave them to the military escort officer. We had his jaw dropped down to his belly button. But that was fairly typical. Carl Rochelle of CNN, we went on a ship one day, and there was a one-star admiral, Rear Admiral Lower, and he stood up there. Now, the rules said that we were not allowed to disclose locations or where we were, actual names of the troops and so forth. And the rear admiral stands up in front of the cameras and says, "Well, here we are in the lovely port of Jubail." And Rochelle shut the camera down. He said he went over and explained to the embarrassed admiral that was a violation of the rules.
Oh, the guy probably been watching Geraldo Rivera.
Maybe he had.
I remember Geraldo was saying something about I'm with such and such a company, and they're going tomorrow into.
Yep.
Quite a flap over that one.
But to go back to it, that was one of the reasons for embedding reporters. But it's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. You embed the reporters, they get close to the troops, they learn how it is and what's going on and so forth, and they can do a better, more understanding job of covering. But then the critics come in and say, "Oh, you're co-opting the press now." See?
Yes.
So you really can't win in that situation.
You're too close.
But I think it's better if you do it than if you don't do it.
Well, I remember reading some of Ernie Pyle's stuff out of World War II, and he was embedded, although we didn't have that phrase at the time. It was tremendously touching stuff when he talked about what these guys were going through that you just don't understand. When he talked about not having changed his socks for 3 weeks or whatever it was, or not having had a shave in a month and a half.
We tried to do some of that actually. We had 6 what we call pencils in that press pool, and so we did, rather than try to do these silly pool reports. What? Pencils are writing reporters, magazine, newspapers. Right. We call
people
them
like
pencils.
You.
Yeah, people like me. But we decided that you always have pool reports. Like when the president travels, there's a small pool of reporters who goes with him. The rest follow on a plane. And usually pool reports are very mundane stuff. The president got off the plane at 12:51 and he was wearing tan socks and, a pinstripe suit. And it's really dumb stuff but they're there in case something happens. And so we decided early on that we were not going to do typical pool reports. We were going to write real stories. So we divvied it up. We had a wire service, the AP guy, John King, in fact, was the AP reporter who's now on CNN. And the other guy from Reuters, and then we had the LA Times guy who had been the Cairo bureau chief, and so we thought he could do the diplomatic stuff. We had a guy from Time magazine, Jay Petersell, who was knowledgeable about command and control, and then Peter Copeland and myself. Peter was with Scripps Howard, so we decided we were going to do the Ernie Pyle type stories. So we had it nicely divvied up, and we did 23 stories in the first 2.5 days, 3 days. We did 75 stories.
Wow.
In the course of the 2.5 weeks the pool existed. So it worked out very well. And I thought I had a really great one one time. It was the Air Force, the chief of the Air Force there. I don't remember his name offhand right now, but he was doing a press conference, and somebody asked him a question about the troops were complaining about the food, because early on they didn't have a lot of food. All they had was meals ready to eat and warm Pepsi and cold French fries, they said, from fast food places in Saudi Arabia. So somebody asked him, what is this about the troops, complaining about the food? And he patted his belly and he said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "I seem to be eating pretty good." And I thought, "You turkey, you're a general. Of course you're going to be eating good." So I wrote the story, and I thought it would create a sensation. Nothing. Zip.
Oh, let me take you back. Did you always want to be a reporter?
No, actually, I kind of fell into it. My father and grandfather were both in the printing trade. They were pressmen, letter pressmen. And when I was in high school, we all thought we were going to get out of high school, get drafted, go to Korea, and get our heads blown off. That was the thing. So we were indifferent, at best, high school students. And most of my friends used to go to work at the Richard Street Auto Body plant because they could make $1.60 or $1.70 an hour. And but my father always encouraged me to get a trade, but he didn't want me working in the press room because it was too dirty and a lot of spray and stuff in the air. So he got me a job running a proof press in the composing room at Wisconsin Cuneo Press. And it was a terrible, boring job. Paid $1 an hour. I hated it, but it led to an apprenticeship. And suddenly I was a printer. I was doing an apprenticeship, learning how to run a linotype machine, making up pages and doing all that stuff. But about halfway through, I'm 20 years old, and I'm thinking, well, when I get to be a journeyman, where do I go from there? And the only thing that was sort of connected to printing was journalism. And I was dating a girl back then who knew the secretary at the Marquette Journalism School, and one thing led to another. I went to see the dean, Jeremiah L. O'Sullivan, who was a famous...
The legend.
Yeah, the legend. And he kind of growled at me and he said, "You're the kind of people we want around here. Come back tomorrow with $200." So I hawked my 49 Mercury at a finance company.
You got the $200.
I went to a finance company a couple of blocks from my house, and they gave me $200 on my 49 Mercury, and I was off and running.
Frank Aukofer, fascinating stuff. The book is never a slow day, and you can tell from listening to Frank that indeed there never was a slow day. And thank you very much for being with us. Always a pleasure to see you. Come back anytime.
Wonderful. Oh, yeah, wonderful. This has been great. Thank you.
And a pleasure to see you as always. Come back next time as we continue to remember.